the French Revolution was largely triggered by a severe financial crisis. By the late 18th century, France was facing enormous debt due to decades of war, including involvement in the American Revolution. King Louis XVI's court was notorious for its lavish spending at the Palace of Versailles, which included extravagant parties and luxuries. However, the heavy taxation required to cover these costs fell mostly on the common people, the Third Estate, while the nobility and clergy were either exempt or paid very little. Meanwhile, food prices soared, especially bread, which was the main diet of the poor. Widespread hunger and poverty deepened the anger of the peasants and city workers. This economic inequality and mismanagement by the monarchy were major factors that fueled the revolution, as the common people grew increasingly frustrated with their suffering and the government's inability to address the crisis. In May 1789, King Louis XVI, desperate to address the financial crisis, called the Estates General, an assembly representing the three estates of French society, the clergy First Estate, the nobility Second Estate, and the common people Third Estate. The Estates General had not been convened for over 175 years, so the meeting was historic. Each estate only had one vote, which meant the Third Estate, representing 98% of the population, was always outvoted by the much smaller First and Second Estates, even though they bore most of the tax burden. Frustrated with this inequality, the Third Estate demanded that votes be counted by head, giving them more influence. When their demands were ignored, they broke away and formed the National Assembly, claiming to represent the true will of the French people. This act marked the first major step toward revolution, as it showed a break from the king's authority and signaled the demand for a fairer political system. On June 20, 1789, after being locked out of their meeting hall by King Louis XVI's officials, members of the Third Estate gathered at a nearby indoor tennis court. There, they made a solemn pledge, known as the Tennis Court Oath, vowing not to disband until they had drafted a new constitution for France. This oath was a powerful symbol of defiance against the monarchy and united the revolutionaries. It was the first time representatives of the people openly challenged the king's authority. The oath gave the Third Estate, now calling themselves the National Assembly, a clear purpose: to bring political reform and establish a government that represented the people, not just the privileged classes. One of the most iconic events of the French Revolution occurred on July 14, 1789, when revolutionaries stormed the Bastille, a medieval fortress in Paris. The Bastille was seen as a symbol of royal tyranny because it held political prisoners and represented the king's absolute power. However, by the time of the storming, it only held a few prisoners, but the real importance of the event was symbolic. The people of Paris, fearing that the king would use force to crush the revolution, stormed the fortress to seize weapons and ammunition. After hours of intense fighting, the revolutionaries took control of the Bastille. This dramatic act showed the king and the nobility that the revolution was real and that the people were willing to fight for their rights. The storming of the Bastille is still celebrated today as Bastille Day, France's national holiday, marking the beginning of the people's uprising. In August 1789, the National Assembly adopted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, one of the most important documents of the French Revolution. Inspired by Enlightenment ideas, this declaration outlined basic human rights and principles of government, such as equality before the law, freedom of speech, and the separation of powers. It declared that all men are born free and equal in rights and that sovereignty belonged to the people, not the king. This document was a radical departure from the old feudal system, where rights were based on class and privilege. It laid the foundation for modern democracy and human rights, influencing future political movements and constitutions around the world. On October 5, 1789, thousands of Parisian women, angry over the shortage of bread and high food prices, marched from Paris to the Palace of Versailles. Armed with whatever weapons they could find, the women were determined to confront King Louis XVI. Their protest quickly turned into one of the key events of the revolution. The women demanded that the king return to Paris to address the food crisis and the growing unrest. Fearing for their lives, the king and his family agreed to leave Versailles and move to the Tuileries Palace in Paris. This marked the end of the monarchy's separation from the people, as the royal family was now under the watchful eyes of the revolutionaries in the capital. As the revolution progressed, it became increasingly radical. By 1793, groups like the Jacobins, led by Maximilien Robespierre, had taken control of the government. They believed that the revolution needed to be protected at all costs, leading to the Reign of Terror. During this period, the government executed thousands of people suspected of being enemies of the revolution, including nobles, clergy, and even revolutionaries who were seen as too moderate. The guillotine became the symbol of this bloody period, with King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette among its most famous victims. The Reign of Terror was a time of intense paranoia and violence, but it also solidified the revolution's grip on power. One of the most shocking moments of the French Revolution came on January 21, 1793, when King Louis XVI was executed by guillotine. After being overthrown, Louis was tried and convicted of treason for conspiring with foreign powers to crush the revolution. His execution marked the end of the monarchy in France and sent shockwaves throughout Europe. It was a clear message that the old order was dead, and that no one, not even a king, was above the law. The king's death also deepened the divide between revolutionary France and the rest of Europe, leading to years of war. By 1794, even many revolutionaries had grown tired of the violence and fear created by the Reign of Terror. Robespierre, once seen as the defender of the revolution, became increasingly paranoid and began executing his former allies. Fearing that they could be next, members of the government turned against him. On July 28, 1794, Robespierre was arrested and executed by guillotine, bringing an end to the Reign of Terror. His death marked a turning point in the revolution, as the government moved away from the extreme violence of the previous years and began focusing on stabilizing the country. The chaos and instability following the revolution eventually paved the way for Napoleon Bonaparte to rise to power. A brilliant military leader, Napoleon took advantage of the weakened government and public desire for stability. In 1799, he staged a coup d'état, overthrowing the revolutionary government and establishing himself as first consul, later becoming Emperor of France. While Napoleon ended many of the revolutionary reforms, he also spread some of its ideas, such as legal equality and meritocracy, across Europe through his conquests. Napoleon's rise marked the end of the revolution and the beginning of a new era in French and European history.